All right, good afternoon. It's March 28th. This is week 10 from Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm Dan Estrada, your instructor. So this week is our research project week, finally. You have the chance this week to have the floor yourself to talk about a research project that you've been studying. So the big challenge this week is really to do the research. And I've had a lot of students emailing me about the sources that they're using, if they're appropriate sources or not. So in this video, what I basically want to do is make sure that you understand the requirements on picking your case, which you should already have a case by now, but if you don't have a case, I'll talk a little bit about that. And then picking your sources. And then I'll say just a little bit more about the specific requirements for the assignment. But let me start by talking about the case selection and source selection, because this is something that students are having a lot of trouble with. If you have any questions, please interrupt me or leave a question in the chat. So the first thing is about selecting a case. So there's a lot of cases that you might pick. Some students aren't always sure about which cases to pick. The two big things that you need to be thinking about are, do you have something to say about the ethics of this case, right? So not every major disaster is an ethical issue, has a lot of ethical things to say about it. So don't just pick some big explosion, but pick an explosion that's relevant to ethics, where you know what decision making went into the disaster or whatever, the fallout and how people were held accountable, where you have some picture not just of the event itself, but also that you have some way of approaching the ethics of the situation. So make sure you have that. I think I mentioned this in the lecture, but the case that, in my mind that's a bad case to use, students have done this the last couple of years, and I really discourage people from doing this, was the molasses spill. There was a molasses spill in Boston around the turn of the century, 1900s. Some big tanker spilled, and it was a big newspaper story. There were a lot of pictures of it, and a lot of people still talk about it sometimes, right? It's a molasses spill, but I'm not sure that there was a whole lot of ethical interest in it. And so sometimes people do a story just to do a story of some weird thing that happened a long time ago. And sometimes those stories just aren't appropriate because they're not as focused on the topic. So try to pick a case that is relevant to the kind of cases that we've talked about in class. The major cases, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the Challenger explosion, the Pinto. You can't do those cases, but you might want to pick a case like that. We've also talked about a lot of minor cases, the whistleblowing cases like the DC-10, from our quizzes, the Bart case, the I want to say Ella Fitzgerald, that's not right. The other cases from the quizzes. I have a list of cases online. For the Katrina case, I also have a couple of sources giving you some idea of the kind of sources. There's a whole journal called Science and Engineering Ethics. One idea for finding a case is to flip through this journal, flip through past issues of this journal to find what science and engineering ethics cases are people talking about. So first of all, make sure that you pick a case that has some engineering ethics. And the second thing is make sure that you pick a case that you can find sources on. If you want to talk about a very recent case, someone last semester wanted to do a case on some gaming scandal. There was a scandal in the gaming world about some game it was something like forcing people to pick a specific gender or race, and then the users got all upset about it, and it became this little sort of mini scandal in the world. That's interesting, especially if you're going into the gaming and career sector. That might be something that's very relevant to your career, and I would encourage you to pick something that you think will be relevant to your career. One of the challenges of this kind of case, though, is that there's not going to be a lot of material on it. So for this case, the student had to, most of the sources were blog commentary, because that's where all the discussion was, and it hadn't made it to any of the academic journals. For a case like that, maybe the primary sources really are those blogs where people are giving interviews with the main players and so on. A blog can be a primary source. So maybe I should move on to selecting your sources. Yeah, so pick a case where you know you can find sources, and the issue about your sources is they need to be scholarly or primary sources. They need to be original sources for this information. Sometimes you learn about some case from non-primary sources, from Wikipedia, from other websites, from documentaries you saw on the Discovery Channel or Nat Geo or whatever. Occasionally, these sources can be good primary sources, but not always. So my example of this is the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I linked to 2 documentaries on the BBC. Those documentaries were sort of generally informing, sort of informative documentaries, infotainment, right? Trying to tell you about the case. But they also contained original information. In particular, they contained original interviews. There were interviews with the CEO. There were interviews with scientists and scholars. There were interviews with the local populations. Those documentaries were the primary source of those interviews. The information that came out in those interviews doesn't exist anywhere but those documentaries. So in that case, those documentaries are a good source for that information. Those documentaries weren't a good source for the information about what happened in the spill itself. For that information, you needed other sources like the reports that I linked to, the MIT Sloan report, for instance. And that MIT Sloan report was a source for the original documents, the original emails, and so on. So all of the sources in the Deepwater Horizon case had some original contribution that you couldn't get that information from any other source. Those are the kind of sources that you want to look for in a scholarly report. Don't just use popular sources. Don't just use popular media. And some news reports might also be just reports that this thing happened, but they might not be the primary source for that information. Right? You want to track down the primary sources. You want to track down original documents. The one thing that I do allow that's not a primary source in terms of original source for information are scholarly reports. So this Katrina essay, this is a scholarly journal article published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it's not the primary source of information for things that happen in Katrina. This is an ethics journal, and what this article is about is an ethical analysis of the Katrina case. So this doesn't have any primary information about the Katrina case itself, but it does have some original ethical analysis of the case. So this could also be used as one of your scholarly sources. And here's the big trick for doing scholarship. This is why it's really important that you give good citations for your work also, is because the way that scholars investigate this material is that they find a good source, and then they mine that good source for all the other good sources. So if you scroll to the very end of this document, so if you scroll to the very end of this document, there's all the sources that this person used, and there's a lot of them. And some of these sources are just general ethical cases, but some of these sources are the primary reports by the government agencies designed to talk about the Katrina event, right? So these are primary sources. These are the direct sources that I want to use. So this ethics article is not a primary source for information about Katrina, but it links to primary sources, and I can use those primary sources as more information, right? So when I read through this article, what I want to be looking for is where is this article getting its information, and then track down that information so I can find where this information is coming from originally. So make sure that your sources are primary sources and they're offering original contributions to your report. A documentary on the Discovery Channel is probably not going to, that Discovery Channel documentary might be the thing that gets you interested in the case and makes you want to learn more about it. But your assignment for this project as a scholarly report is to track down the good sources of information and build your own understanding of the case from those sources. So hopefully that makes sense. The big example that I use, and I talk about this in the lecture also, but I talk about this in the lecture also, but it's such a common case for this assignment in this class that I want to emphasize it again here in the Hangout. So a lot of people do Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island or other nuclear disasters. It's completely appropriate to do one of these disasters for this case, or for this class, for this assignment. And one of the first, right, so if you look up Chernobyl on Google, one of the first links after Wikipedia is the worldnuclear.org website. Worldnuclear.org website, it's been updated recently, and it contains a lot of really great technically specific information about what happened in the Chernobyl disaster. It gives a lot of background. This is much more detailed than you find in the Wikipedia page. It gives technical details, even schematics of the nuclear power plant. This is a great source for information, but it's not a primary source for information, right? So all the information in this report is taken from other sources, and what this World Nuclear Association report is, it's basically a detailed encyclopedia entry into what happened during the Chernobyl event. But this is not a primary source for any of this information. However, like all good research, if you scroll to the end of it, you will find where it gets its primary sources. So there's the notes, and then here are the sources. They have specific references that they use, and notice that all these references are direct reports from the government agencies that oversaw, the international governing agencies that oversaw, and the United Nations and so on, that oversaw the impact of the Chernobyl disaster, right? So these are the reports where you will find the first-hand accounts, where you will find the primary sources for all the information of what's happening. The World Nuclear article, which is full of good information, it gets all this information from those primary sources, right? So your responsibility as a scholar is to look into the primary sources and have these be your primary source of information. You can use I don't want to stop you from using the worldnuclear.org site. It's a good site, but it can't be your primary source. So it shouldn't be one of the 4 sources that you're using for your annotated bibliography. Don't bother to do an annotated bibliography for an encyclopedia article. The encyclopedia article is already a secondary source, and so you commenting on the encyclopedia article isn't very interesting. What we want to see is your take on the primary sources. Maybe match those primary sources up with your reading of the encyclopedia article, because the encyclopedia article might get some things wrong, and you might discover those errors by looking through the primary sources. And it's your responsibility as a scholar to be looking for the primary sources. So hopefully that helps give you some idea of what I'm looking for in the sources. Let me actually do something here. Yeah, so one mistake that students often make, and this will end up having students get, this will be reflected in your grade. One mistake that students often make in this assignment is that they look up journal articles so that they have some official reference for their annotated bibliography, but they don't actually use those references at all in their report, and their report is basically just taken from Wikipedia. Don't do that. Make sure that the information in your report is actually coming from the sources that you say that you're using. If everything in your report just comes from Wikipedia, and none of the things in your sources is actually employed in your report, then this will get reflected. This will be reflected in your grade. It's bad scholarship. Smith asks in the chat, can we have more than just 4 primary sources? Can I attach to the link after my article? Yes. So here's how you want to do this. You want to write your report as normal, and then, as any other week, have at least links to your sources under that. Right? So if you use Wikipedia, if you use the Discovery Channel documentary, if you use worldnuclear.org, make sure you link to those sources. If you've consulted those pages in the course of your research, make sure to link to those sources. Putting Wikipedia in your references is not a bad thing, as long as that's not your only source, right? If you use that source, let me know. If you use that source and you don't put it in your references, that's a kind of plagiarism, right? That's a kind of failure to cite your sources, failure to give credit where credit's due. And you can have far more than 4 sources. In fact, I expect you to have far more than 4 sources. The assignment for the annotated bibliography is to take 4 of your scholarly sources, the 4 sources that you use for the most of your scholarly research, and to give those an annotated treatment, right? So to give those a full citation and annotation for 4 of your primary sources, for 4 of your scholarly sources. Those 4 sources are the sources that you learn the most from and that you want to direct other people reading your reports to go check out. Yeah, so if you do use Wikipedia, please say that you use Wikipedia. So the way this should work is that you write your post as normal, and then just as any other week, at the end of your post, put a link to all the sources that you use. And then in your first reply should be your annotated bibliography with you only need 2 for this week, 2 of your primary scholarly sources with full citations and annotations. I think I've seen people do this correctly. Yeah, so this is just, I'm going to use Emron just as an example here. I've hidden the grades, so you can't see any of the grades. But this is an example of how the structure should work, right? So he has his title and post, and then at the end of his post, just as normal, he has references he uses and links to those references. But then in the first reply, he has the full annotated bibliography with 2 of the sources, and then a paragraph annotation explaining why the source is useful. This is structurally, this is exactly what I'm looking for. And if you use Wikipedia, or if you use worldnuclear.org, or if you use that Discovery Channel documentary, if it's something that you've consulted in the course of your research, throw it up in the references right here. I'm only asking you to do the annotated bibliography for 4 of your most important sources, most important scholarly sources. I want to emphasize one more time that if you use Wikipedia, don't be afraid to put it in the references up here. So I think there's a trend going around, maybe in the writing instructors on campus, to really discourage students from using Wikipedia. And one of the consequences of this discouragement of using Wikipedia is students are using Wikipedia anyway, but they just don't cite the sources in their references because putting Wikipedia in the references they feel makes it look bad or whatever. So they just don't cite Wikipedia, even though they use it. And so I've come, in my other classes, I've come across students writing essays that clearly are taking from Wikipedia, but never mention them in the references. And I think the reason for this is that it's not that they don't want to credit Wikipedia because they want to, it's not because they want to plagiarize, but it's because the teachers tell them not to use Wikipedia at all, and so they don't want to say that they're using it. So I'm not like that. I like Wikipedia. I'm pro Wikipedia. Use Wikipedia. Just be clear that you're using it. And remember that it's not a primary source. As long as you remember those things, then use Wikipedia all you want. In fact, I'm going to make Wikipedia the word of the day, the secret word for this Hangout. I haven't set the quiz this week for that to register, but you should be able to take the quiz for this week with Wikipedia as the secret word. And I'll go through and change the answer and regrade them. Yeah, so post your essay. So Mustafa asks, so our essay is posted first, and your annotated bibliography comes in the first reply, right? So this is Emron replying to his own thread. The first reply is his annotated bibliography. Yeah, put a normal reference list at the end of your post as you would normally do for any other week. But then as your first reply, put your annotated bibliography. Remember that the grading scheme for this week is that your post is worth 100 points as opposed to just 50 points. So it's worth twice as much. And it's required to be twice the length also, or 50% the length. So a normal week's minimum requirement is 400 words, and it's worth 50 points. And this week's minimum requirement is 600 words. You can go over 600 words, but too much under 600 words, you won't be able to say everything you need to say to explain the case. So 600 word minimum requirement, the posts are worth 100 points instead of just 50 points. And then no quiz this week. Instead of a quiz, you have your annotated bibliography. The annotated bibliography is worth 20 points. 20 points, so 10 points per source, and then it's 5 points for the annotation. I believe it's 3 points for or 2 points for the citation and 3 points for the quality of the citation. Right. So if you have a correct citation and a good explanation, but your source is bad, your source is Wikipedia or worldnuclear.org, I'm going to take off a couple of points. That's the assignment. If anyone has any other questions, I hope I've made everything clear about exactly what I want. I'll say right now that lesson 10 is this week. Lesson 11 next week should have the same structure, should have the same setup as this week, where you're doing a post with an annotated bibliography in the first reply. For lesson 11, your post should be on the ethical dimensions of the case. The big difference is that for your annotated bibliography, I want you to include all 4 sources. So you do 2 this week. You should do 2 new sources next week for week 11. And in your first reply where you post your annotated bibliography, I want you to post all 4 of those sources. So not just the 2 new ones that you did, but also the 2 that you do this week. And I'm doing that just so I can see all 4 that I know that you're not just copying over the 2 that you did from last week. So Mustafa says, I might have said this already before I got here, so I apologize. Don't apologize. Please ask as many questions and keep asking the same question. If my answers aren't clear, please ask the same question until you are very clear about what's going on. So he says, are we going to annotate all 4 of our primary sources in the reply? For over the course of this entire assignment through week 11, in week 11 you should have 4 sources with annotations in the first reply. For week 10 this week, you only need 2 sources. 2 sources with full annotations. You could have a bunch more sources than that, right? So Emron here has 5 different sources that he used for this report. He might have even more sources in his week 11. I don't want you to do an annotated bibliography for all of your sources, just the 4 that you think are most important, most informative, that you learned the most from. So you need to do 2 annotated bibliography entries this week, and then 2 new bibliography entries next week for a grand total of 4 over the entire project. Mustafa, was that clear? Good. Thank you, Emron. I don't think he's in the chat, but thank you, Emron, for letting me use your post as an example. Does anyone else have any questions about picking a case, about picking your sources? Amaka asks, will the annotated bibliography be our replies for this week? No. So you need to do your annotated bibliography that's worth 20 points, and that 20 points counts as your quiz credit for this week. So there's no additional quiz apart from the annotated bibliography. But in addition to both your post and your bibliography, you also have to do 2 replies as normal. Those replies are worth 15 points, just as they are in a normal week. So there's no change in the replies. You still have to do 2 replies. The idea here is that you do your research report and then you read at least 2 other people's reports and sort of get into a little conversation about that. Part of the goal of this assignment is not just so you do the research on your own, but also so that the entire class has an opportunity to encounter all of these different cases. We've gone over maybe 4 cases as a class. Because everyone's focusing on the same cases, we can't go so fast. But hopefully, there's 60 people in each of these sections. There's 180 people in all of my sections total. So hopefully that means 180 different cases. Probably not that. In a 60-person class, you probably have maybe 40 different cases, 45 different cases that you might be able to look at and learn something about. A lot of these cases you might have never heard about before or talked about before. So hopefully you teach yourself something new. Hopefully you teach each other something new. What are examples of primary sources? Good. So a primary source, let me see if this, no. So a primary source is the original source of information, right? The original source is another way of saying primary source. The best example of a primary source for the kind of cases that we're talking about are the government reports. So if you remember from the Chernobyl case, there was a big report written that detailed exactly what went wrong. In the Katrina case here, in the Katrina case, there's a bunch of government agencies who, the Interagency Performance Task Force, Performance Evaluation Task Force, IPET. This was a performance evaluation review of the protection system. This is a government report on the viability of those hurricane protection systems. This is a primary source for information about the nature of those systems. Those are the original source of information, where we got that information from. Primary sources don't just need to be government reports, though. A primary source could also be, it depends on the case. So one kind of primary source would be like original pictures or videos of the event. If you have pictures or videos of the event, sometimes those pictures are used to do an analysis, and those are considered primary sources. Original interviews. So for the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the interviews with the CEO in those documentaries, those were primary sources for those interviews. The reason that those documentaries have the original information in those documentaries are the information that they're getting from the direct interviews with the primary players in that situation. Right, so that's also a primary source. It's a primary source for that information. Government reports. The other thing that I am allowing as a scholarly source that's not a primary source are these scholarly journal articles. So if an article is published in a peer-reviewed journal on the case and contains some kind of original analysis of the case, then it might also be acceptable. So this article is about ethics during the Katrina case. This article is not a primary source of information for any information about what happened at Katrina. All the details of what happened, who was held responsible, all that kind of stuff. The primary source for that information has to come from elsewhere. But this is a scholar, an ethicist, doing an ethical analysis of Katrina and introducing some concepts and some theory to analyze Katrina. So this kind of analysis, it's not a primary source in the technical sense of primary source for information, but it definitely is a scholarly source, published in a peer-reviewed journal. So this would also be the kind of sources that would be perfectly acceptable for this assignment. Sometimes investigative journalism can also be a primary source. The Mark Dowie article, Pinto Madness, that released the Pinto memo that got all the Pinto controversy started, that was published in an investigative journalism, an investigative journal, Mother Jones. Mother Jones does original reporting. So that was a primary source for that document. So you might find those kinds of things in investigative journalism outfits. So the New York Times, Washington Post, Mother Jones, Christian Science Monitor. There's a bunch of investigative journalism outfits that do uncover original information, and that could also count as a primary source. But you have to be careful here. What counts as a primary source? It really depends on what information is there. The New York Times might be a primary source when they do an investigative journalism piece, but they might also just be reporting on some fact that happened where they're not a primary source at all. So you can't say in general that the New York Times is a primary source. It depends on what they're talking about. So take this research seriously. Don't just, and students have done this in the past where they just look up articles on their topic and then they cite those articles, but they never actually look at the articles or read the articles, and all the information in their report comes directly from Wikipedia. That's bad scholarship. It'll get you graded down. It'll get you graded down on your bibliography because you didn't actually use any of those sources, and it'll get you graded down on your report because your report is just rehashing Wikipedia. Right? I want to see that you've actually taken the time to investigate the case, right? Actually look into the case, not just at what people say about the case, but what actually happened at the case. And to give it some original thought, to think about it. That's generally the point of these assignments, is to give you some time and space to think about these issues. Mustafa wants to know what the secret word is again. I'll write it in chat. I won't say it again, so that way you can't just fast forward to the end of the video. The secret word was said in the middle. I was talking about other things. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? For the week 8 lecture? That's not the case. I gave a secret word in both. No, I gave a secret word in both the lecture and the video and the Hangout. Yeah, I just went to check. So there's definitely people who got both the Hangout and the lecture secret word correct for lesson 8. So it's definitely in the videos. If you didn't find it, you say you watched the video 3 times. I'll tell you that, first of all, the points here are extra credit, and second of all, it's not that many points. It's like 2 points, 2 or 3 points per video. Make sure you keep in mind how important it is to find these secret words compared to all the other things that you need to do. Please don't spend 3 or 4 hours trying to hunt down those 2 points. It's probably not worth it. But it's definitely the case that some people got both the secret word in the lecture and the Hangout correct. So I know they're there. All right. If there are other questions, or if you do have other questions, just send me an email, send me a message in Moodle. I'll try to stay on top of replying to people before the end of the week. You do have replies due from lesson 9 due last week. Due tonight. Lesson 9 from last week. Your replies are due tonight on. The climate change and geoengineering stuff. If there's any other questions or comments, thoughts. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the video. Thank you, everyone. Good luck on your reports.